Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 350 library systems across the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so happy to welcome the prolific, best-selling, and award-winning author, John Irving, to talk to us about his journey as a writer and his most recent novel, The Last Chairlift. Hi, John. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm super excited to get started. I know everyone else is too. Let me kind of give that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then we will get things rolling. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration from the viewers, but keep in mind you can always submit a question during the talk and just click that questions button that's below this live stream video. There are a lot of you tuning in tonight, so we will get to as many questions as we can. Now, to formally introduce our guest for this evening. John Irving was born in Exeter, New Hampshire in 1942. His first novel, Setting Free the Bears, was published in 1968 when he was 26. Irving has been nominated for a National Book Award 3 times, winning in 1980 for The World According to Garp. In 2000, he won the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for The Cider House Rules. In 2013, he won a Lambda Literary Award for In One Person. Internationally renowned, his books have been translated into more than 35 languages. A Prayer for Owen Meany is his best-selling novel in every language. John Irving is a dual citizen of the United States and Canada. He lives in Toronto. So, John, can you read and speak all 35 of those languages?
Oh, heavens, no. I only speak one other language, German, and I do not speak it very well, even though I was a student there for more than a year and worked on my first screenplay there for more than 2 years. One of my children was born there, but I'm just not very good at foreign languages. That's the only one I have some understanding of. My German isn't even good enough so that I could actually read my own work in German. It's conversational. That's as good as it is.
Well, that's still pretty good. I'm probably not conversational in any other language. I sometimes like to tell people that I could get by in Spanish, but I'm probably being too nice to myself. So let's open with Kim's question. Kim says, I've followed you since the late 1970s when I was in college. You've always stayed so true to your style, which brought so much pleasure to myself and my friends and family. You've said you write about things you fear the most. Is this evolving, or does fear keep you motivated to continue writing?
I was a very young father. I was a father the first time when I was still an undergraduate. Before I graduated from college, I was a father. When I was first a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop and an MFA program, I was already married with children, and I'd wanted to be a novelist from the age of 15. But from my early 20s, when I was a father, the subject of the fear for someone you love came into my writing with the birth of that first child. I had never loved anyone as unequivocally as I did a child. Perhaps this had something to do with my age, or it had to do with how happy I've always been to be a father. But with the joy of being a father came attendantly the fear of losing a loved one. And that subject has not only deliberately become a part of so much of the scheme of my novels, but sometimes unconsciously is there as well.
Yeah, so can you think then to the first story that you ever wrote? Was that fear there after you had a child, that is? Was that fear there? Were you writing purposefully with that fear to bring it to light, to try to face it?
Only after Colin, my first child, was born. And 4.5 years later, he had a brother. And by then I had incorporated the fear of the loss of loved ones into the longer trajectory of my novels. It's not there in the first novel. It doesn't come in until the second novel. It's not at full strength, I think, until the fourth novel, The World According to Garp, by which time I'd been a father long enough to recognize that the fear didn't go away. As your children get older, if you're anxious at all, you just see them as more vulnerable than they were.
I can relate to that, that's for sure. So Sam is asking then, what inspires the next story? So how do you decide to write the next story, the next novel, or the next screenplay?
You know, I've always been lucky that my novels live with me for a long time before I begin them. They begin as casts of characters, as storylines. They exist in every case for more years as notes for a novel I'm going to write one day than it will ever take me to finish them once I start, even the longest of them. In other words, they exist as a pile of growing pages, a growing storyline, an eventually complete cast of characters. They exist in outline form for more than 5 or 6 years before I'm going to start. In the case of Last Night in Twisted River, 20 years. Now, that's unusual that I would wait that long. But because I'm so ending driven, because I will not commit myself to writing the first chapter of a novel until I'm very certain what the last chapter will be, I need to know what the most important things are that are going to happen so that I can write toward them. When I start writing a novel, I have many more notes about how it ends than I've even taken about how it begins. If you know how a novel is going to end, beginning it is easy.
Has your intended ending ever changed in that process?
Not yet.
Not yet? Wow.
No. Now, beginnings change all the time, but in the architecture of a novel, when I say beginnings change, I've often begun a novel, and by the time I get to chapter 4, I realize, oh, chapter 4 is a better place to begin. It's easy to move around the first 2 or 3 chapters because not everything hinges on them. It's not so easy if you have to do that with an end chapter. That's never happened to me, but I don't want it to happen.
No.
That's why I do so much planning ahead of time.
I think your formula is working out for you. Jane says, do you write pen to paper or use a computer for your first draft? But I think I've read that you write your entire first draft, right? Handwrite?
I wrote the first draft of my first novel on a manual typewriter.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when I was revising it by hand, I realized that I made so fewer mistakes writing in longhand than I made on a keyboard because I typed very fast. My mother taught me to type when I was 13, 14 years old. It was a great advantage as a student going to school to be able to type all my papers, and sometimes my friends' papers too, because they knew I could type. But with the second novel, I wrote the first draft in longhand, and the first draft was much better because it was slower. And over time, I've learned, yes, the first draft is slower if you write it by hand, but there's less revising to do in the next draft. And the time you've taken to write that first draft by hand will reward you later in the process. It turns out for me that writing in longhand is the pace I should go when I'm writing a screenplay or a novel.
So what about
you can see over my shoulder that slant board, that slant board. That's what I write on. That's I write on a board that's tilted, so it's very easy. I can proofread what I do standing up or sitting down. I can move around. That's what I do.
The Last Chairlift, 889 pages you wrote out in longhand first.
Well, remember that book pages.
Sure, are a lot.
There's a whole lot fewer book pages than
A lot.
It was well over 1,000 pages in manuscript, and that was after an assistant had typed the manuscript, had written it in her computer and printed it out for me, and I just began revising by hand on the printed out copy. I do not work anymore. I don't own a typewriter. Of course, I have a laptop to write emails to my family and my friends. I don't write them by hand. But I do all of my writing by hand. I like it.
Yeah. So Miriam is saying, do you feel your education was imperative to becoming a quality author, or can one self-teach, so to speak?
Well, education is a very broad word. I mean, I think my early reading was instrumental. The novels I read as a teenager, particularly the great novels of the 19th century, those novels were and remain the model of the form for me. Mm-hmm. It was Charles Dickens's Great Expectations that made me want to be a novelist, but only if I could be a novelist like Dickens. I was 15 when I read Great Expectations. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the first Dickens novel I read, but it was the one that made me believe, made me feel committed that I would be a novelist. I could be a novelist, but only if I could be like him. Mm-hmm. I was 17 when I read Moby Dick, the Melville novel, for the first time. And that was the novel that showed me how much Melville had known in finite detail, how his novel was going to end before he began. Dickens wasn't an ending guy. I love Dickens. He was my role model. He was my hero, and still is. But he wasn't so good at endings. He wrote a lot by the seat of his pants. He made things up as he went along. I think Melville, like me, was much more plodding. I think Melville had to know where he was going, had to know what happened in the story before he started. Mm-hmm. So at 17, at 15, I had an ambition, and Dickens was my source. At 17, I saw there's a method to this. Moby Dick has a method. And those two things, those two models from the 19th century have not disappointed me.
I think that they've not disappointed us, the readers, either. So thank you. So we have a lot of questions about character building. So Lee and Kim both are asking, how do you build your characters with the end in mind or with purpose? And Lee wants to know, piggybacking on that, how do you plot their actions? Do you let them lead you, or is it all about the ending with the characters as well?
You know, I've heard writers say that they listen to their characters and their characters tell them what they must do. I have not had that experience because I'm so determinedly ending driven. I know what needs to be clear is formative in a character's development because I know what's going to happen to that character. I hope my novels are realistic in the sense of true to life, but they're not constructed the way real life is. We don't know what's going to happen to us. But I think it's relatively easy to know what a character's childhood and adolescence or younger life should be if you know how that character ends up.
Mm-hmm. Betts is saying there are common characters across your novels, or common character themes, I guess. Small people, trans people, religious leaders with wobbly faith. Do you intentionally include them in each story as a means of elevating their voices in the real world, or do they just keep showing up and asking for a seat at the table?
Good question. Both. Both. Often I fool myself into thinking everything's intentional because I am so much a plotted novelist. I am so much character and ending driven, but I have found myself before thinking that a character was new. And all of a sudden I think, oh, I know who you are. Here you are again.
Mm-hmm.
I've changed your name, but now I see who you really are. Now I see where you come from. Think of how many in the last chairlift, think of how many forebearers Nora has. This strong, independent, inflammatory woman. Think of how many Noras I've written about. Hester.
Mm-hmm.
Brefro and Meany is a Nora. Melanie in the Cider House Rules is a Nora. It just goes on and on. I don't always intend to write about the characters who are writers either. The part of their being, them becoming writers or being writers, is not necessarily a part of what forms their character. But writing in most of our lives comes a little later.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have a childhood before we're writing, and so it's a combination of yes, it's intentional, the overlapping of these characters, but it takes me by surprise sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You said we have a childhood before we're writing, and I know that it can sometimes be gauche to ask an author about whether their characters or books are autobiographical, but you've been pretty open about your books having somewhat of an autobiographical framework, right?
Well, I think the more accurate way to describe the autobiographical beginnings of my novels is that there is often a resemblance in location and in the age of who the main character or the principal characters will be. I'm very interested in the formative experience in childhood or in early adolescence that will determine the kind of adult that character becomes. Something happens, or a succession of things happen to a child or an adolescent, which is, we all know, a sensitively formative time in everyone's life. A time of first things, first sexual intimations, first awarenesses of what adults are really about, especially if they're not entirely as they seem. In the beginning, I'm conscious of using familiar autobiographical material, but only when I start. What happens to my characters is never what has happened to me. How my characters begin, their circumstances as a child, as a teenager, their family circumstances, especially if their family circumstances include a mystery, an unknown factor, a missing mother, a missing father, someone who's not entirely divulging to a child his or her past. That's a familiar starting point. But I would say in my case, my novels aren't autobiographical because where they go and the drastic things that often happen, there's a lot of doom in my novels. There's a lot of setting up characters for a fall, especially characters whom we care about. You're not going to care what happens to a character if you don't like that character, if you don't have some emotional investment in that character. So I'm always thinking of how to make characters, if not likable or lovable, at least compellingly interesting enough so that a reader wants to know what happens to them, because they sure look like something is going to happen to them, and it isn't necessarily good.
So let's transition to the Last Chairlift for a little bit. The Last Chairlift story takes, for those who haven't read it, because we have plenty of people that tune in who haven't always read the book before they tune in. So by way of summary, the story takes Adam Brewster, who's a novelist and a screenwriter, from infancy to old age. His father, unknown for most of the book. His mother, a ski instructor, is away most of the time. He stays with his Nana. And then, of course, a stepfather, an English teacher who transitions to female. But it's also this sweeping family saga that we're familiar with, about sexual identity, risk, and the storied history of Aspen, Colorado. So Faith is asking, where or what was your inspiration for The Last Chairlift, and why set it in Aspen? So I think that Aspen probably was part of the inspiration, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, the Hotel Jerome in Aspen, which is real, has a real or much documented history of ghostly appearances, very specific ones, ghosts that many people who've worked there and many guests who've stayed there have seen. A small, fewer than half a dozen in number, but a repeated number of repeated sightings, people who've refused to ever stay there again because of it, people who've canceled their vacation and left because of it, people who've worked there and have resigned because of it. I'm terribly disappointed that as many times as I've stayed in the Jerome, one time after I'd finished the first draft of The Last Chairlift, expressly I hoped to finally see one of these ghosts that so many people have seen. It didn't happen to me. It happened, however, to my assistant who went with me to Aspen. She saw one of those ghosts. She had an experience with one of them, but not to me. That notwithstanding, I've always said about ghosts, they are, as far as I can credibly imagine, the spiritual world. As a non-religious person, ghosts are as much of the so-called world of the spirits that I find credible. Too many rational people, my assistant included, have had sightings or experiences with ghosts, apparitions, stronger than just feelings.
Yeah.
I believe them. I must be perceived ahead of time as a kind of party pooper that the ghosts have never chosen to entertain me.
You want it too much.
Well, maybe that's it. Maybe they kind of know what I'm looking for and say, "Oh, the heck with him," you know. I don't know. And the last time I went to Aspen, I went purposely during mud season. Nobody goes to a ski town in mud season. It's too early to be hiking or mountain biking on the mountain. There's no snow to ski on. And I not only knew the Hotel Jerome would be virtually empty, as it turned out, my assistant and I were the only people staying in it for the short number of days we were there. I even asked for, and it was the first time it was available, because in the past I've only been there in the ski season, or once to a comedy festival in the summer. I got to stay in Jerome B. Wheeler's own room, the room he stayed in when he was there. The guy who founded the hotel, who went bankrupt because of it. Well, if ever there's going to be a ghost, wouldn't it be in his suite? No. Nothing. Slept like a log, nothing happened.
So are you going to keep trying? It's one of your favorite hotels.
No, I'm done.
Turned in the ghost hunting.
To go back to the family saga part of this story, which is more important, I believe, than the ghost. Yes, it's a ghost story, but it's also a love story of a family that is much loved and deservedly so. But it's a family that I have purposely reversed from the usual family that has within it a queer family member. In this case, purposely, I'm writing a novel in the point of view of the only straight character in his family. All the other members of his family are queer. All the people who love him and take care of him so very well are queer. In his family, being the straight guy makes him queer in the sense of odd one out. So it was very deliberate on my part to switch the rules.
And he's clueless about this for most of the book.
Well, yes. And I also think it will come as no surprise to any reader that the straight guy in this family is, no argument, the most badly behaved sexually That's been my observation throughout my life. Generally, straight men are the most badly behaved sexually.
I mean, I'm a woman, so I'm not going to argue with that. So you also like A Prayer for Owen Meany, use this narrator and speak from a first person point of view.
Well, I choose very reluctantly the first person voice. It's the last voice I want to be in. I love the third person omniscient more. I would rather write a novel in that voice than in any other voice. Any story you tell from the point of view of a first person narrator is going to be longer than it would have been as a third person story. Why? Because you have to explain how that narrator knows what he or she knows. There's a whole lot more explaining to do. There's more exposition. It slows you down. It drags out the length of the novel. And in the case of both A Prayer for Owen Meany, one of my longer novels, and The Last Chairlift, my longest novel, I knew I was making, in both cases, long novels longer. Why do you do it then? Or why do I do it? Well, if the principal emotional objective to the story is how much it's going to hurt to lose a character you, the reader, loves, or to lose characters, plural, you, the reader, loves, you're going to feel the loss of that character or those characters more deeply if you're in the point of view with a character who loves them and knows them more than you do. It's going to hurt more.
Yeah.
It's going to have more of an emotional impact. That's why I do it. I learned that from Moby Dick too. Ishmael, the first person narrator of that novel, is going to lose everyone he knows.
It's a bit of
Everyone on the ship goes down.
Yeah.
But he,
Using Moby Dick is a bit of foreshadowing in there. Kate was asking, at what point of developing the story did the Moby Dick references take hold? Was that something planned, or did it?
Always. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, very planned. And it occasionally strikes me as a little too heavy-handedly planned. I mean, a little too obviously planned because the grandmother's preternatural love of it, this novel, and her unrealistic expectations that as someone as young as her grandson is could actually understand it, could actually follow it. Well, that's where the fiction comes in. It was hard enough for me at 17. I can't imagine it happening to me at Adam's age unless someone's reading it to you and you love the person who's reading. That's why it works.
So Amy is asking, why did you choose to have M not talk? But M wasn't the only mute character in The Last Chairlift. But to continue Amy's question, she says, I remember the women in The World According to Garp who cut out their tongues, and I want to know more about this creative choice and why he used another form of the lack of speaking by a woman in this novel.
Well, in M's case, M is close to my favorite character in the novel. In my case, I wanted M to have a crystal clear and very good reason to stop talking, but an even better reason to start talking. I wanted her emotional background to empathetically, sympathetically set up her reasons for not speaking, so that when she decides for an even more emotional reason, for the sake of a child, she doesn't care what other adults think of her, how strange or queer other adults think she is, but she doesn't want the child to feel this way about her. She wants to reach the child. She wants to be in contact with the child. Well, in many ways, I find M the most understandable or empathetic character in the novel, or she is. She is to me, and the trauma her family inflicts on her that justifies her not speaking, and for the sake of a child, her deciding to speak. That was one of the most indelible lines that I followed in the course of the book, especially concerning the book's ending. I knew that M had to be one of the principal architects of that ending.
So Krista is saying, it seems like you take such care into how the characters are referred. So the little English teacher, snowshoer, little Ray. Can you talk about the process of choosing to stick with, I guess, the adjectives describing some of these characters? She says each reference felt just right. Was this something that you focused on during revision or proofing, or did you largely stay with whatever naturally flowed out when writing? It was almost like this was the character's name, Little Ray, the little English teacher, the snowshoer.
I probably drive my assistant and my wife, who are my first two readers, I probably drive them crazy because of how fussy I am about the interchangeable names I have for the same character. And I hope that I'm always fussing with that. And I want it to become second nature to the reader, to recognize these important major, minor, or major characters by more than one name, by these modifiers. And I can't tell you why I do it, but to me, it makes the characters themselves, it's easier to visualize them. I think it becomes a defining characteristic. It's a detail that is more integral to who the characters are than the way they dress or the sounds of their voice or other more peripheral things. Everyone over the course of a life has been called more than one thing. Many of us have names that we were called in childhood or in adolescence that no one else ever called us as we got older. And so, and this can happen to people with the most common name, such as John. The people in my life who still call me Johnny are either in my family, or they're wrestling teammates. It came with a period of time. I'm not Johnny to anybody else. And that's a simple example with a common name. Well, if you want to make characters more indelible, more clear than that, the snowshoer, the little English teacher, these become, they replace one another. I guess that's why I do it. I think it's a little compulsive, and I know it kind of occasionally gets to my assistant or my wife, those early readers who will occasionally write in the margin, "Enough of this, all right." It's like, or I have an editor who will occasionally write, "Oh, stop it."
Oh, stop.
I get it. You count on people to, to let you know when you're just being a pain.
So what do you want readers to take away from this novel? Or maybe the better question is, what does this novel, The Last Chairlift, mean to you? And what do you want readers to take away from it?
I like its trajectory. I like the linearness of it. It's a very funny first act. Right up through the wedding, it's funny. And there's a turn there where suddenly these characters who are entertaining, who are comical, and most of what happens in the early chapters is of a comical nature. There's a moment when suddenly the narrator is afraid for them. There's a moment when the narrator suddenly realizes, oh, they're not exactly who I thought they were. They're more vulnerable than I thought they were. And there is that change between Act One, which is called Early Signs, and which is funny, until you get to the end of that act, when he realizes his mother, who his evil aunts are saying is marrying a gay man. When he finds out, the narrator finds out that his mother is in a relationship with another woman. And these three people, his mother, her husband, and her lover, the narrator realizes after the shock that, oh, please, I know this is strange, but don't let anything happen to them. And the next act is called The Honeymoon on the Cliff. I was tempted to call the whole novel The Honeymoon on the Cliff. It would have worked, because the whole story is kind of a honeymoon on a cliff. Mm-hmm. These characters are vulnerable because of who they are and how the rest of the world looks at them. I mean, Nora is the most obviously vulnerable because Nora is a provocateur. Right. We know something's going to happen to Nora. That's not that's one of those obvious surprises in a novel. What happens to her is surprising. That something will is not surprising.
Yeah.
She's a troublemaker. Um, uh, well, and the other people worry you more because their vulnerabilities are more subtle, but no less there.
Yeah.
And we certainly know about Adam's mother that as brave as she is, as singular, as individual, as independent as she is, everything that happens in the last chairlift happens because of little Ray. She's the one who makes everything happen. Without her, there's no story. Well, we also know about her that she can go too far. That even if we love her, even if we forgive her eccentricities, she has the inclination to go too far, where every reader will say, oh, what? That's not right. So she's dangerous too, but in a different way than Nora is.
Mhm. That's a parallel with The World According to Garp, his mother. Without his mother, there is no story.
That's quite true.
Yeah. So The Last Chairlift wasn't always the title, but we don't learn about The Last Chairlift for quite a while. So why the title switch? Did you go through several titles?
Well, I had a precedent in an earlier novel that was helpful to me in the case of this novel, which was always called, from the Shakespeare epigraph, Darkness as a Bride. Another good title. I have more titles than I can use. My chapters are titled. I got that from the 19th century novelists too, right? I title every chapter. I always end up with more titles than I can use. Well, I love it when I have more than one title for a novel. The more the better. But there was a precedent earlier for me that helped me make the change in The Last Chairlift, and that was the Cider House Rules, which was not the working title of that novel. It was always called, when I was writing it, The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's. That title ends up being the title of the first chapter. It's a good title for a first chapter about an orphan who keeps getting sent back or who runs away and runs back to the orphanage. It's a good title for a first chapter. If it had been the title of the novel, two things are wrong with it. It would have given too much away.
Mm-hmm.
You would know when the orphan leaves the orphanage, oh, don't worry, he'll be back. That's the title of the novel.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
So you're kind of given it was a title that kind of gave my ending away in a way I didn't like. But the Cider House Rules, which comes later in the novel, just the way The Last Chairlift comes later in The Last Chairlift. It's a late appearance in the story. The Cider House Rules is what I call an actual title. It's a real thing. They're stupid, these rules. The people they're written for can't even read them. Once the people who know what the rules are know what they are, they won't follow them. They're dumb rules, but they represent the more important dumb rules that exist in the sexual society of the time. Namely, the rules regarding abortion are also dumb. And they're also not they're similarly not relevant in the way the cider house rules aren't relevant. People don't abide by them. People won't abide by them. So here was a kind of poetical, imagistic title, The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's, and I replaced it with something actual and real, which you don't even get to until later in the novel. Well, that was a part of my encouragement. When I got to that last chairlift, I thought, oh, this is the beginning. That last chairlift is the beginning of the end of the novel. That chapter called Written in the Snow, where we see what the purpose of that last chairlift really is. It's a hearse. That's what it is. It's a hearse. Well, that had, to me, a similar impact to what the Cider House Rules had in the writing of that novel. In the case of Darkness is a Bride, I had another compelling reason, which is two of my earlier readers, my daughter Eva and my wife Janet, said the title of this novel should be The Last Chairlift. They were telling me, they said, yeah, the Darkness is a Bride is pretty, but it's not as germane. Now, like all of my novels, I give it to a lot of so-called experts in manuscript. And just as there were readers of the Cider House Rules who liked The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's better, so there were readers of this novel in the early manuscript phase. There were also readers of this novel who wished I had called it Darkness is a Bride. They were sort of sold on the poetic title. Well, this one, as I said, The Honeymoon on the Cliff, Darkness as a Bride, Rules for Ghosts. There's a lot of titles that could have worked. My unhappiest title experience was with The World According to Garp. I hated that title. Huh. It was always just a working title, and I always thought I would find a better one. The problem was, when I delivered it to my editor, I didn't hold back the title. I was still trying to think of a better title, but I submitted the novel as The World According to Garp. And I didn't tell Henry Robbins that I didn't like the title and that I was looking for a better title. I should have sent it in untitled, because when Henry read it and a couple of other people at Dutton read it, they couldn't imagine that the novel could be called anything else.
So you were stuck with it.
And nor had I really come up with something that I could convincingly argue on the behalf of. Well, it was a learning experience. I always thought it was a somewhat funny and not a good way title. I was a kind of compromising title. It was an odd title, especially when you consider, given what happens in the story, that the novel really is The World According to Jenny. What happens in the novel is the world according to Garp's mother. She's right, he's wrong. So I had a lot of problems with that title, but I never had an alternative to it.
How do you feel about it now? Does it still bother you?
Well, it's been around for so long. What could I do? You know, you finally have to say, okay, I let that one out too soon, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's honestly, that's the of the 15 published novels, that's the only one that the the title just never felt right to me.
Yeah. Well, so you say with The Last Chairlift that this is your last long novel, but you're not done writing. You're going to continue writing. So I guess my question is, you could still potentially write long novels, because this one was almost 900 pages. You could write a 400-page novel and it wouldn't be long for you. So what are you meaning when you're done with long novels?
Well, there was a moment when I was writing this novel. I mean, I suppose it would have been fashionable. It certainly would have been commercially advisable if I'd decided that The Last Chairlift should be a trilogy. It could easily have been published as 3 books, as 3 novels. It is as long as any 3 novels. It wouldn't have been cheating. But there's a good reason why I didn't think about that for any longer than it's taken me to tell you. Because my readers who know me know that I know where I'm going. If they've read my earlier books, they know I know where they end. If there's nothing else they can count on, they know I know what the ending is. They feel that way. They've read those novels. And what would I have been, how badly would I have been manipulating the people I care the most about, my readers, to make them wait for 3 novels published over 3 years, when my readers would know that I'd already written the end of the trilogy, and I'm holding it back. So it's taken me more time to tell you my process of considering The Last Chairlift as a trilogy because of how long it was, and then saying no. Because the people who would be really and rightly angry with me are the people I care the most about, my readers. So I didn't do that. For some years now, I have been conscious of choosing among those stacks of pages, which are novels waiting to be written. I've been in the habit of choosing always the novel that I know the most about the ending. That's a given. But in the last decade, I've been more conscious of adding another factor to my choice, namely, write the hardest one or the longest one first. Do you give yourself a break? Leave the shorter or easier novels till the end. Write the harder ones or the longer ones. Now, there's a difference between longer and harder sometimes. This is my longest novel in terms of the page count, but it was one of my easier novels to write. Many novels that have been shorter have taken me longer to write. The reason I say this one was easier is that there's nothing in it that is outside my own personal experience. I didn't have to go somewhere and learn how it is to be in someone else's shoes. I've grown up in ski towns. I've lived in ski towns. I grew up in a ski family. One of my children is the director of a ski resort. He runs the ski patrol. This is all familiar territory to me, and so I didn't have to. Luckily, as it turned out, total coincidence, because I began the novel in December 2016. It was a great novel to write during the pandemic because I didn't have to go anywhere. There was nothing I had to learn. The one trip I took, as I told you, with my assistant to the Hotel Jerome, hoping I would see a ghost, was after I'd finished the first draft. It was not a research trip. And
Ghost hunting trip.
And the ghosts aside, the real reason for going was it was a great time. No one was in Aspen, and my assistant and I could have total access to the great Aspen Historical Society. And the Aspen Historical Society was a great help to me in writing this novel.
Mm-hmm.
So, but all of that was after the fact. That was just fact checking. Now, the Cider House Rules is a shorter novel, but I had to spend 2.5, 3 years studying obstetrical and gynecological surgery from a period of time before I was born.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, before I could even get started, right? A widow for 1 year, I had to spend months in Amsterdam learning about the relationship between the police department and the prostitutes union. I couldn't have created that murder of a prostitute with a witness and how the police would find the killer easily, but the witness harder to find. I couldn't have created that circumstance if I didn't spend a lot of time with the woman who ran the prostitutes union and the cop who was in charge of the homicide division in the red light district. That was a lot of work outside my the knowledge, the things I've grown up with. All the tattooing and Until I Find You, a lot of work before I could get started, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by harder doesn't always translate as longer. Longer doesn't always translate as harder. Here's the truth. There are no more really long novels left. I know how long the trains in the station are, and I'm writing the next longest one first, but it's going to look like a normal novel. And probably for me, it's going to look like a short novel. But I think it'll be a kind of average novel length, average by today's standards. And in the world of literary fiction today, it's gotten shorter than when I first started writing fiction. The world of literary fiction has shortened. Not me, but it has. Well, I know what's in those piles of pages, and
you've started your next book already?
Yeah, I'm already more than a third, maybe as much as a halfway into it. That's how much shorter it is, because here we are, barely a year after The Last Chairlift was published in English, and I'm in the 15th chapter of a novel that may have only 30 chapters or less.
And you want to tell us all about it, right? I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
No.
All right, John. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We did run over just a little bit, but it was all for our benefit. So thank you very much.
These were some wonderful questions, and this has been most enjoyable for me. Thank you.
Very happy to hear that. I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video, you can find a link to John's book in the resources tab. We look forward to seeing you all next week when we talk to John again, but not John Irving, John Stamos. He is coming out with a memoir today, actually, October 26th, I think it was, called If You Would Have Told Me, and we will be in conversation with him next week on November 1st. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.
Good night. Good night from Toronto.